Most entrepreneurs waste years chasing the wrong kind of business, a business that didn't fit them. Because success isn't about copying someone else's playbook. It's about building a business that matches your natural identity, unless you want to fit. They're that colleague who always gets asked, can you explain this to me? If you force yourself into a lane that isn't you, then you're probably going to burn out. It's called the 5 Entrepreneur Identities. And once you know yours, you can finally stop second guessing and build a business that fits who you are.
So Michael, what's the first one?
So a teacher is how they sound. Somebody who teaches other people. They are the, if you will think about them in terms of a quick tagline, the I'll show you how. And, these are folks who are monetizing by basically explaining to people, guiding, breaking down complex ideas. You could almost say Art and I fall into this here in the podcast. Of course, we would argue what our personality type is, which we'll probably get into a little bit later on. But ultimately, their value is in transferring knowledge and helping others to learn. They're that colleague who always gets asked, can you explain this to me? Or maybe the mentor who's helping somebody grow. Ultimately, a teacher is, as they sound, somebody who's taking the skills that they have and helping to teach others what those are. One caveat, though, is sometimes teachers begin to eventually package their stuff up. Let's use an example like Laura Acosta. Laura is somebody who was first somebody who was teaching, but now she's taken that and she's evolved to another one of these identities that we will talk about shortly. Other famous examples, James Clear, you may know from Atomic Habits, and maybe Tony Robbins, who's ultimately one of the ultimate teachers out there. There are others. Authors often can fall into this category, as can people who run blogs, YouTube channels, and such. I think something that a lot of teachers don't realize is that they've been doing this for years for free, meaning they get so good at it, people come to them, but a lot of them don't ever think about how they monetize that. And speaking of that, it actually leans heavily into our next identity, which is that of the freelancer. Arden, take it away.
Yeah. So number 2, the freelancer identity. That's kind of exactly what Michael talked about. Let me do it for you. It's the person that has some very specialized skill set that people are willing to pay them for. Graphic design, websites, accounting. There's a lot of different things that fall into this.
Assassin.
Yeah, exactly. You're basically, a go-to expert for something. And as a freelancer, once you build, a few people that trust you, they're just repeatedly coming back to you for repeat business. And that's how freelancers turn that into a solo business, because they have regular people that keep coming back to them. It's being a craftsman for that special skill, and dependable, and you solve problems and make it easy. It could be that somebody, sure, they could use ChatGPT to write a blog, but they don't have the time, or they don't want to do it. So that's where a freelancer comes into play.
So what are some examples of freelancers? Maybe some that were on our podcast and maybe a couple famous ones.
On the podcast, we've had Helen Liu. She built a AI agency. A really good famous example will be Justin Welsh, which I think if you're in the LinkedIn circles, you've heard of Justin's name.
Yeah, and Justin's a really interesting one too. We'll kind of come back to in a little bit, because he has then evolved his business to that next level, because I think this is something really important that kind of identifies whether or not somebody is going to stay in this freelance forever or whether or not they're going to find themselves out of it, is that a freelancer is kind of how we all start in the workplace. Like, that's the baseline. Like, almost everybody should begin there, because they got to figure out which of these other identities they're really good at. And you do so by doing some sort of repetitive task over and over again. And by the way, something else that I thought was interesting, you mentioned Helen. We also had Ritesh Verma, who was another one who's also in the AI agency space. So I think there's a lot of people now who are leaning into that as that freelance skill. And I think a lot of them are those who are trying to get around the 9 to 5, and are looking at, this is a skill I could learn, get really good at. But I think the key is, and Helen said this, that I really appreciated when she was on our podcast. She said that she had to realize at one point that she had to stop pretending to be an entrepreneur and actually be an entrepreneur. And I think that switch for her was when she was actually moving out of just that freelance kind of straight up mode and starting to think about how she could lean into another one of these core identities to grow, a bigger business.
If you like what you're seeing and you want to see more, be sure to click on the like button, subscribe to our channel, and click on the bell. It lets YouTube know you want to support the This Is The Way podcast, and it helps spread the word, and we greatly appreciate it. And now, back to the episode.
Yeah, and I guess that's a good segue, because to grow a business or even to convert a solopreneurship, a freelancer gig into a business. Michael, what's the third identity that you got to have?
Yeah, so I think operator is another interesting one. And again, to clarify for anybody who's hearing these, it doesn't mean you're going to be all of these. You will often have two that you lean into a little bit more solid. One's perfectly acceptable, but the idea is a lot of people end up evolving and picking on a couple of these different ones. And it can happen over life as, you unlock a little bit more about yourself, as well as when you just pick up new skills. So operator is, think of the person who's running the systems and the people. These are those that you would, think about when you see them in the workplace as naturally leading, businesses or business, units. These are people who can lead people and often think in terms of systems. They're, trying to leverage the systems and the people to be able to accomplish more of what they want to get done. So their strength is often in scaling, and that's through the people and the infrastructure. Now, leaders, those who evolve into that, are natural fits for this. I would say that Artin, I think you and I both leaned heavily into this particular one as we evolved from our freelancer state, of being independent contributors in our work.
I totally agree. Yeah.
And I think you and I also happen to lean heavily into another similar one, which we'll dive into a little bit. But this is actually an important aside for people to consider with these, because if you are building a business that requires a strength or an identity that's not the natural one that you fall into, the whole reason we've assembled these and broken them out this way is because that's where danger comes in. Because if somebody is starting to try to build a business and that's not the fit for who they are, for example, if they need to build a business where they're the operator, but it turns out they don't like leading people, then that could be a bit of a challenge for them. But that's where this framework can also come in handy, because that's where you might look at the partner who's really good at that. And you've got famous examples in the past, where you've got, an individual like Steve Jobs and Wozniak who team up and they complement each other in this sort of way. Or some people bring up like a Walt Disney and a Roy Disney in a way to complement each other as well. But this is where when people choose partners, sometimes they choose a partner because they're like, I like that person. You should be choosing that person often based on the identity. And obviously it's not bad that you also like the person. So operator examples, or let me actually touch on a couple of jobs here. People who are out running, small businesses, I often think about as operators. Now, it doesn't mean you can't have somebody who's running a small business that's in, that consultant base as a solopreneur or something like that. You can. But if you think about somebody who's leading these larger companies where they've grown them to 15, 20 employees or more, that's the type of small business that I heavily look at here. They're the people who are constantly looking at how they can continue to grow and scale that business. And there's some famous ones out there you could think of right now. One of the ones that people know who's actually in the space of trying to get other people to buy businesses, Cody Sanchez. Another one, Howard Schultz. I mean, look at what he did with Starbucks and building over the years. In fact, when he stepped away, the company kind of struggled a little bit there. And sometimes that can happen when you have such a driving force and operator in a business. Sam Walton, who built Walmart. Basically, anytime you could think of one of those famous entrepreneurs who built some, crazy business and now we look at it as $1 billion business, and McDonald's, another great example. It's like these types of businesses are the ones. Now, in that case, that was Ray Kroc, who came in and saw how he could look at that business differently and the systems that really helped it grow. Because before that, you actually had more freelancers in the business who were really good at sort of the day-to-day, but they weren't really good at breaking outside of that.
So what are there some example businesses that a operator should look at starting?
Yeah, well, I can't help but, again, lean heavily into those businesses that are mom and pop chained, if you will, owned, or maybe a little bit larger than that. So look, if somebody starts off, as an example, they were freelancing in the event production and they were doing some of that for people, but all of a sudden now they grow a team because they set up these events. That person has now grown and become more of an operator. If you look at somebody in the short-term rental space, which I plan, it's like in that scenario, somebody who's running a business like that, I would also see as an operator. Again, when I say somebody running the business, let's be clear. There is a chance that somebody's running that business and they're not an operator. But when that normally happens, that's where their struggles, because those are the people, for example, who jumped into something because they're like, hey, short-term rentals, perfect example of this. I'm looking for passive income. And it's not passive. They got to be an operator. And if you weren't an operator, because that's not what, jives with you, you just like the returns that you heard a guru talking about, well, then you're going to run into struggle because that business very much relies on somebody to be an operator. Other example, just had a meeting with a friend who runs a pressure washing business. He's absolutely, an operator in that business. Although I will say, because he's an interesting one, he grew it as an operator, but what he really enjoys doing so much now is more of the innovation side of things. So he's hired a president to take on more of that role for him so that he can step and play more. And I would say fit a little bit more into one of the categories we'll get later when we talk about Productizer.
So just to kind of reiterate, we're not saying that you can't be an operator. We're saying that your identity, if you identify as an operator first or operator second, you're probably going to like doing that role more, which then increases your chance of success. So it's definitely not saying that you can't float between the two.
Right.
Because the next one we're going to talk about, number 4, is the connector identity. This is where, relationships come into play, the network. I would say that, a startup founder that kind of is a natural salesperson, they're the connector. They're able to get people to believe in their vision, raise money. Not to say that the other identities can't do that, but somebody that leans into being a connector just has a easier time with people and connecting and going to events and talking. Maybe you can call them a little more social, but I've seen, people that are not very social be good at this as well. So that's who the connector is. And they always seem to know someone. Anytime you say, do you know an angel investor? Yeah, I know 5. Do you know this? I need a fractional CMO. Yeah, I know this person. Like, they always have a network they can lean on, which at the end of the day helps them in their business. Because when they want to now start moving from a sales role to actually operating a business, they can tap into their network, which then helps them their business.
To me, and I probably say this because of how I identify in this scenario, which because I'm more the operator, not the connector. I appreciate and love connectors because they do that thing that I'm more of an introvert too. It's just not my natural sort of inclination. And, when we had, for example, Frank Bastone on the show, and he was talking about, you see how he lights up around that sort of thing. And that's how a lot of these connectors are. And you see him in the workplace as well. And I'm not just talking about the one who just wants to, go by the water cooler and talk. I'm talking about the person who you just know naturally. It's like, oh, I know so-and-so, let me connect. And these people I think are great. But are there some famous ones that you could think of?
Maybe Reid Hoffman, founder of LinkedIn. I think he
built the ultimate connection machine. Yeah.
That networking connection. You can argue Oprah, because of what she did. You can argue Richard Branson maybe was a good connector, even though he's a brilliant operator now.
Yeah.
Of everything he does. So I'm trying to think who is, I would say probably the one that has always been in this area, because when I think about the sales aspect of connector, Grant Cardone is just a natural salesperson and has a network around them that has helped him, grow his business into a massive.
Yeah. No, that's a great example, and I think that he's an interesting one when you just say Grant Cardone, because he's played in various spaces. People might look at him and be like, well, but look, he's an educator, a teacher. He's an operator. He's this. When he was on, I forget what the show was called, but the one where he had to build $1 million business in X amount of time. It was amazing when you saw him, and in that scenario, the connector side of him you could really see unleashed. And I think that when we talked about before Freelancer, because people might wait, is sales a connector? Eventually, if somebody's doing sales, it can fall into connector, but I think that's that fine line. Let's say you're in the workplace, you get good at sales. That's often where you then say, okay, great. You might take that out freelance, but you evolve to that next level when you actually go with the connections, because some people are good at sales, but they may not connect. But I do think that those who are great at it usually build out that Rolodex of people, and they do it because that's enjoyable and fun for them. So that's a good person to know if you're business building,
Oh,
a gym,
oh yeah.
because they can connect you.
Yeah.
I was curious here too, and on the other side, we've around some of this, we've built out a GPT engine as we look at this and really further build out this framework. And I was just looking at it to try to see, okay, where would Branson fall? Because I think you were right when you said that, and you said he might have involved more too, but his core is around connector, brand, network, and culture. And ultimately, if you really look at it from the operator perspective, even though you can't help but see him there to a degree, well, really, what he did is he used his connecting abilities, and he often found, and he even highlighted this, I remember reading one of his books on it, like he looks for great people to run the businesses, and he kind of leads them to run the business. So anybody out there who's like, oh, you got to be a great operator to run a business. No, look, all of these are entrepreneur, identity types. And I think in that case, somebody like Richard Branson absolutely leaned into his connector style and was still able to grow a very successful business. So while people may not think about that, naturally for like a connector, it's like, oh, you absolutely can. It's just that's where, like, knowing his identity, he knew he needed to find really solid operators.
We talked about Justin Walsh earlier, but I think now it ties into how you went from a freelancer to the fifth identity. And what is that one?
Yeah, a natural evolution for teachers, and this is ultimately the Productizer. So this is the person, hard to say, I know, maybe we come up with a new name for it, but the Productizer, they turn knowledge into assets. So if you think about it initially with the Justin Welsh, who, was doing a lot of some of the content creation. I mean, he was working with people in general, I think, around
Copywriting.
Yeah, exactly. And then he took that and then he decided, let me package this up as a course or a program, and now let me sell it, because now I can still show up and teach somebody without necessarily being one-on-one or group coaching. And again, natural evolution, because this is where a lot of teachers might scale. However, I think that there's this fine balance with this one here, because not all of the stuff that, is being taught to people translates really well to a product. Like sometimes there's certain things that people are looking for, that individuality and coaching around. This is something that Art and I both talked about, within the career space, because people are sometimes looking for like that personalized feedback. But this is a natural way to go for a lot of people. Laura Acosta, who we mentioned before, is one of those who went this direction as well. But if you think about it, they ultimately are looking at scale. They might use software. It could be templates. It could be platforms that ultimately continue the work without them. So their value is in packaging and systematizing knowledge. So natural fits for this, are people who are, think about in the workplace. I mean, you and I were this sometimes. We're like, well, can we turn this into a template? Or can we standardize this process? What does that look like? Once we standardize it, we're like, well, can we automate this then? So ultimately, almost always thinking about how something can run without them. And these people could be good possibly in building, SaaS startups. These individuals could be good, and you see them out there when they're selling these Notion, libraries. They've created a bunch of Canva, related templates that they're selling that way. A great example of this is actually somebody who literally teaches people to turn their knowledge into assets. And that was one of our first guests ever, Owen, who came on, and he literally, I think, wrote a book on this topic, but he literally helps people who've been in that knowledge position, but haven't figured out how to kind of scale to that next level. And he helps them in doing that. Now, I think what's interesting about that, and I think his approach as well, is that somebody might be like, but what if they don't fit into that, personality type? How is he going to get them to go there? Well, again, that's why he also teaches them how to leverage everything from VAs and others, so that if they want to grow that way without doing the things that they want to, that they can. And probably something else that would be interesting for us to do a follow-up on, and, for our listeners, let us know if you'd like us to do a follow-up on actually what marketing is best for you based on your identity type, because that's another thing that people really need to consider, because your identity type means that certain types of marketing are going to feel better and more natural to you. So
I got a question for you.
Yep.
So let's say that you're a tech entrepreneur. Maybe this falls under the SaaS startup. But that's kind of what you lean into, because you like that idea of bringing something from your head bring it out into the world. But you're not a teacher. So someone like that, what would be kind of the products that this person would constantly try to build a business around? SaaS startup, yes, but what else would you say falls into that category?
So wait, you're saying they're not a natural teacher?
They're not a natural teacher.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what about when we look at it, when you think about right now, what a lot of people are doing when they're looking at how they can turn steps for a business into in workflows or automation. It's like,
that's a great example.
Yeah. And this is why I think Ritesh and Helen have evolved more into this. And I think they saw it as the way to hit their own entrepreneurial goals. This was that natural next step for them. And I think what happens of why a lot of teachers and others kind of flow into this one is because eventually they hit this point of frustration where they're like, we've got to figure out how to solve our bottlenecks. And this becomes a natural way to do that. It almost just becomes their way out.
Would you say, from a famous person perspective, Steve Jobs is definitely one of these?
Yeah, absolutely. Steve Jobs, he'd fall into this. I would say that, other obviously real famous ones, when you consider Jeff Bezos, would be another one. Although Jeff Bezos is also a strong operator, is where I think he kind of fall between these two categories, which, by the way, that's where we said we are. So why aren't we building Amazon yet? Come on, Arden. Yeah. So I think that's it. That's it for Productizer. But Arden, for you identify more as that and an operator similar to me. Is that correct?
My gut tells me that I'm going to lean into a operator productizer. I can never say that word, but productizer.
Yeah,
but we'll see. We'll see.
No, I think that makes sense, as I think I am too. And something really important that we want to stress, and it's a core reason why we were thinking through this sort of framework, is that there's a big danger in misalignment. In fact, if you force yourself into a lane that isn't you, then you're probably going to burn out. A connector who's stuck making solo courses is going to burn out. A freelancer trying to fake charisma as a teacher, they might flop. You have to keep this in mind, because if you are stretched outside of your lane, you can't scale fast enough in your natural strengths.
Yeah. And I would say, Michael and I both are investors as well, startups and other funds. And one of our criteria is usually the founder's dominant identity kind of aligned with the business they want to do. Because to us, if it's not, it's a signal that, maybe they don't have the resolve to push through the tough times, because they might say, this is not for me.
Right. And at that point, then the question too, it was like, okay, have they got pretty far with this? Is there the right person to pair them with who can complement them on the style that is required and needed? And for a lot of businesses, that's where they end up struggling, because the person's like, no, I can do this. They don't want to do it with that other, companion that they might need in the business. And that's ultimately really important as well, because if somebody can't see past their own weaknesses, we're seeing where it's likely going to come based on what we've witnessed before. It's something you don't want to ignore. So here's the takeaway. Your identity is your shortcut. It tells you which business model fits, which doesn't, and even who to partner with. But for now, the challenge: which identity are you?